Hi, and good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar. I'm Phil Schaefer with the American College of Healthcare Executives National Office. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items. For the purposes of noise control, your lines will be muted for the duration of the session unless there's an active discussion at the end, at which point you can unmute yourselves to talk. You will also have the opportunity to submit questions through the chat panel throughout the discussion. So please, it's encouraged to submit your questions as needed. Today's session is worth 1.5 hours of face-to-face education credit. Credit will be applied to your ACHE account approximately 2 weeks following today's session. Excuse me. To ensure your credit is applied, please be sure that you're using the Zoom platform on a computer or the Zoom app on a smartphone or tablet. Also, be sure that the name you're using for your Zoom session matches the name of your registration. This session is being recorded and will be available within 48 hours. And with that, I'd like to introduce Will Moorhead. Will, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you guys for joining us today to talk about the political elections. And I'm just kidding. If you're paying attention, I hope your stomach just rolled a little bit. I'm sure you've had enough of that. My name is Will Moorhead. I am the facilitator today. And the logos in front of you are what are the folks that are going to be speaking, including myself. I'm the president and one of the owners of All Clear Emergency Management Group. And we do healthcare emergency preparedness on a national level. And so we have a perspective. And so from a facilitation point of view, I'm going to be listening to what each of the folks that Randy, and Alex are talking about, and asking some questions and hopefully facilitating your questions as we go through, not by way of sales pitch, but just by way of perspective for why I am facilitating. I have been a firefighter for, actually that says 23 years. It's almost 30 now, 29 years in December. And that sort of created my, my career path trajectory to end up going to law school. So please don't hold it against me that I am an attorney. And I know that one of our presenters, Randy, one of the Randys is a police officer. So I know that's 2 strikes against me to be a firefighter and a lawyer. But what it has created is the ability to ask a lot of questions, and it gives me a perspective. And so I am still active in the fire service, but worked for South Carolina Emergency Management and then also the Department of Health. So I've done emergency management and public health in the course of my career. And we're 11 years in business as a consulting firm, and I've been consulting for a couple of years prior to that. And what that has given me that informs today is a big picture perspective on multi-state activities and questions and problems and challenges, but also within healthcare, the very level of healthcare. So whether it's at a facility or at a system level, whether it's home health or a big hospital system, we work with all those folks. We're working in several states. And so we're almost 30 states that we're actively working in. We have employees in 5 states, and we manage healthcare coalitions, and we also do planning, training, and exercises. So we write plans and train folks and run exercises and do vulnerability assessments. And we are the healthcare coalition coordinator in a couple of states. And so what that gives us is a lot of perspective. And so this slide, I just want to share a couple of things with you guys as we get started, almost as a sales pitch for what the 3 presenters are going to talk about. And then I'm going to circle around with some questions. But I want you to understand the importance of your connection in healthcare, and it's one of our objectives for today, but it's your perspective, and you're part of the overall emergency management community. We did a project years ago where we were doing vulnerability assessments and risk assessments with communities, and facilities said, and this was I reside in Colorado, and I was in Colorado doing this project when a hospital said that snowstorm was really high on their risk assessment. And several people in the room looked at them strangely as if to say, why? Because this is Colorado, we know how to deal with snow. And they said, well, the problem is that if we lose the pass, then we are without linens for a couple of days. And so that really straps our ability to do healthcare. And so everybody in the room is, emergency managers and public health folks are scrambling to change their risk assessment. And I said, hold on, we need to dig into this a little more. And they said, well, it's actually, so then the problem is losing the pass. It's not snowstorm. And then as we dug into it a little more, we realized that ultimately to that community, what everybody feared the most wasn't losing the pass, because a lot of supplies can come in from a different way. And it wasn't snowstorm because the pass can go down from a landslide in the summer as much as it can from avalanche in the winter. What they were really concerned about was loss of the provision of healthcare in their community, because if that hospital goes down or the supply chain to healthcare goes down, that impacts everybody in the community. And so that was a real eye-opener, I think, to a lot of people, that the vulnerability of their community really relied on the resiliency of healthcare within their community. And another exercise we were in, somebody said, you know, we always talk about communications. And I said, right, but you've said that for the last 5 years I've worked with you guys. What are we doing about it, right? We always talk about that. Is it, if it's a common issue, but it's not our common focus, right? So are we talking about the devices of communications? Or are we talking about how we exchange information with one another? And so today, as we understand the connection to emergency management and how vital healthcare is to each community, then we also have to look at how we're communicating. We're communicating our vulnerabilities and our needs, and then when we're responding, how will we go about exchanging information, whether it's, again, on a particular device or the process by which we consolidate and exchange information. And so that leads me to the final sort of sales pitch of today, and the importance of what you're doing today in the 90 minutes we'll spend together is the investment in emergency management. And I hopefully some of you have seen or remember the movie Remember the Titans from, and it's a Disney movie, but it has one of my favorite lines in all of preparedness. And the captain of the team is talking with the star of the team, so it's Gary and Julius. And Gary is sort of chiding Julius for being a little selfish in his play and his teamwork. And Julius is saying, you know, I'm going to get mine. I'm out for me, and then I'm not worried about you guys. And Gary says, that's the worst attitude ever. And Julius pauses and he looks at Gary and he says, attitude reflects leadership, Captain. And I say that because in the hundreds of exercises I've facilitated and the trainings that we've been in with tons of healthcare facilities and systems, and we've sat with the C-suite down to the very lowest level employees. The thing that is always resonated is if the organization embraces emergency management, then emergency preparedness and emergency management becomes a culture. And it's not a strange thing, and it's not a challenge, and it's not a burden. It's something that's really beneficial. And so as we continue through, we're in the second wave now officially, I think, or the third, I don't know, of COVID. As we're headed into that, to see the value of the incident command system, the hospital incident command system, to see the value of using those things. And as we talk about efficiency and we talk about assessing our vulnerabilities and providing value and providing efficiency when we're short on so many things, including patients, not patients, not the people, but the attitude of being patient. All those things are running thin right now. And so as we see that emergency preparedness and emergency management can help us, I hope today the three presenters are going to talk about really the value of that and a little bit about how you can do some of that, how you connect with your community, and I hope you understand how much your community relies on you and really looks to you as one of their major vulnerabilities. So we're going to walk through several things. Randy, and Alex are going to go through those things. I will be watching the chat, and hopefully you guys will chat some questions in, but then also toward the end, we will have we'll pause and ask and have an opportunity for questions, but toward the end, we'll have a Q&A session as well. I hope that you guys remember you are the captain and that the attitude of emergency preparedness is really driven by you. And so, and hopefully, you know, today will be beneficial to help you begin to lay a roadmap on how to improve that. So with that said, we will transition to our first presenter, and looking forward to your questions and your input as we go through today.
Hey, thank you, Will. My name is Randy Haley, and I am the Randy that actually does like the fact that you're a firefighter. If you look at my bio, you can see that I started off as a volunteer firefighter in 2001, currently serving as fire chief of Akron-Princeville Fire Department. That introduction into the fire service really got me started into emergency response. It wasn't until I started at the hospital here until I got interested in emergency preparedness. There's two similar items there. I've done various roles for the hospital. I started as a safety officer and then moved into disaster preparedness for St. Francis Medical Center in Peoria. With that, I'm the RHCC lead for the state, Region 2, and also I serve on the executive board for our SILCARP coalition, which I'll talk about a little later. Shannon, can we go to next slide? So, like I said, I work for OSF Healthcare System, specifically St. Francis Medical Center located in Peoria. I wanted to kind of give an overview of what OSF Healthcare System, what we encompass as a system. So as you can see on the slide, we employ more than 23,000 mission partners in 147 locations. 14 of those are hospitals, and the rest make up MSS and 10 acute care for critical access with over 2,000 licensed beds. Specific to St. Francis, where I am the emergency preparedness manager. We are a level 1 trauma center. We are a teaching affiliate for U of I. We are the 5th largest medical center in Illinois with 649 licensed beds, over 5,000 mission partners, and we're home to the Children's Hospital of Illinois. We are also the regional hospital coordinating center for the state, Region 2. With that, what that means is we are the resource hospital for 24 hospitals spread over 18 counties. If you've watched the news lately, you see that Illinois is broken up into regions, and Region 2 is where we are. You can see right there in the band of the middle of the states. So that's how we're broken up. The regions RHCC was really highlighted in the pandemic, the communications, which I'll talk about a little later also. We can go to the next slide. So one of the things that we conduct, and one of the community partnerships that Will was talking about, is for us at St. Francis Medical Center, we perform an HVA annually. Not only is it a requirement by Joint Commission, but it's also a good tool to have in your toolbox to understand what you need to prepare for a system. So what an HVA is systematically evaluates the damage that could be caused by a potential disaster, the severity of the impact, and the available medical resources during a disaster to reduce population vulnerability and increase the capacity to cope with disasters. So for St. Francis Medical Center, we conduct our HVA with community partners. We do it with Peoria County Health Department. Historically, that includes Peoria or police, fire, EMS, all sorts of different capacities compile our HVA, and we kind of do it countywide to serve for the hospital. So I wanted to highlight where our 2020 HVA was conducted in 2019, January or December of 2019, and posted in January 2020. You'll notice that our number 1 is severe thunderstorm, tornado, active shooter, blizzard, and ice storm, all weather related events except for active shooter. Some highlights of that: pandemic's not on what did not make our top 5. Technology codependency did not make our top 5. So historically, I would expect that next year pandemic probably be number 1 as preparedness activities go. But even looking at tornado as number 2, if you're familiar with the Central Illinois region, you know that in 2013 we had a Washington tornado go through. The next year, tornado was number 1. Now, as years have gone away from the tornado that went through, it starts to shuffle down the line again for our HVA response or activities. So now severe thunderstorm is number 1, tornado is number 2. I bet if we had another string of tornadoes go through next year, tornado would be number 1 if it wasn't for the pandemic. We can go to the next slide, please. So I wanted to kind of highlight some weaknesses and strengths of not only HVA, but as emergency management as a whole. And when I look back at the HVA, we see technology and IT failure as not registering on a HVA, not even in the top 10 on most places. But we do have a dependency on technology, and technology has a apt to fail. So when we do have those failures, it provides a weakness for our systems and healthcare systems as a whole. What I mean by that, some examples of that, just today, I got an email from IDPH stating that there were hackers and scammers sending out scam emails, trying to get hospitals to order vaccines. So as much good as technology is, there's always somebody bad trying to hurt our systems, and that happens frequently. I know at OSF and my peer following me in this presentation can attest that we get phishing emails, and if you click on those, then that requires a half-hour training afterwards. So we try to be cognizant of our time and our efforts to prevent those scammers and hackers to get into our systems. So when I say dependent on technology, also, we do rely on technology an awful lot. We use them for EMRs, situational reports, phone systems. Just at St. Francis Medical Center last week or 2 weeks ago, our phone lines went down. Big deal for us. We did not have outbound phone calls or inbound phone calls for the medical center, which means that our technology was done. So when that happens, we had to put plans in place instantly. Instantly, we open up incident command. So I think some of our weaknesses dependent on technology, if we look back at the pandemic response, actually turns our weaknesses into strength, and dependent on technology is an example of that. Before, we are all comfortable in incident command now, so it was opened up immediately. External, internal communications were sent out on how to be redundancy in those communications. So that's a weakness that I'll turn into a strength in a couple more minutes here in my presentation. Another weakness is resources. So emergency management is constantly competing with resources. Space, staff, and stuff are the three things that everybody needs to have a successful emergency management response. Space, staff, and stuff really drive the force and the response to the event that needs to be. So for an example of that, our pandemic response, one of the things that in the beginning of the pandemic, we saw McCormick Place pop up in Chicago with however many hospital beds. We saw different hospitals and local health departments, and to this day, we're still talking about alternative care sites, trying to get those up and running, perhaps, and get staffed beds for patients, COVID patients. In the beginning, we had an internal discussion in our incident command and realized that our resources were competing with each other. Everybody wanted these alternative care sites. So yeah, we had the space. We had some stuff. PPE was a big driving factor of our response, but we didn't have the staff. We did not have the staff to send to these locations to stand up these mobile hospitals. So resources are competitive, and it's a weakness, and it needs to be worked around. Your best plans that you can write all depend on space, staff, and stuff. I think if we look at all your pandemic plans of the past or current, they all, you can write rainbows and butterflies on everything and make everything great. But unless you have those three items, they're not going to be successful. And that alternative care site is an example of how that would not come into fruition. So when we talk about resources, obviously, then we go into time and how we train for that. So emergency preparedness in healthcare organizations is a competing resource for nursing, for doctors, for everybody really. Nursing, obviously we're on this call because people need credit hours. And it just so happens we're in emergency management, so we can actually get our message out, which is good for us. But in the hospital setting, that's not always the case. Emergency management is not forefront on nursing. It's not a big part of people's day. We're kind of like a mushroom. We sit in a closet and grow and until we're needed, and then we get pulled out and we're like, hey, you got to work. And nursing and everybody is expected to know that, and it's hard to compete with those resources. So the time management of that and competing resources are a weakness for emergency management. So when we shift into strengths, how do we overcome that? And one of the ways is a dedicated manager, sorry, excuse me, and dedicated emergency personnel to drive that platform. So at our hospital system, we have 14 hospital units. We also have 14 emergency managers or coordinators or whoever across the system that engage with each other monthly on what we need to do for a system to keep ourselves resilient. One of the ways I can highlight the benefits of an emergency manager is the pandemic. We'll resort to that, and I'm sure that'll be talked about a lot today. But when we look at our pandemic plans, pulling them out in February, they probably resembled something like H1N1 or Ebola. Nowhere on there was COVID-19. Nowhere on there was COVID-19 response. So I know personally early on in our response, or I watched the news, I watched this thing roll in, I watched the cases pop up in Seattle, in California. I kind of had a feeling that it was going to progress this far. So I took out our pandemic plan, dusted it off, and updated to 2020 to reflect what I thought. I worked with infection prevention to work on what I thought would be a response to COVID-19 at that time. Now, what I wrote in February probably does not look the same as the response today, but that's the dedication of an emergency manager, and that's what highlights the importance of that. So moving on to with electronic platforms. So when I talk about a weakness on dependent on technology, technology is also an asset to us as we move forward. Reverting back to the pandemic, I think most hospitals in the areas, at least in the state of Illinois, use a technological platform to make resources requests, put out situational reports daily to the state. We're updating our bed numbers. I know as the RHCC lead, we used EM resource a lot to put our bed numbers in, and I could easily answer an IDPH call off those numbers. And we use it for resource requests. In the beginning, we started using our SEMP tool, which allowed us to put in what we needed as a hospital and would push that out. Also emails, I would get emails daily on what PPE we would be needing. So with all that being said, how does that lead into another strength? And we can tie all that in with community engagement, and that in using the pandemic as a platform again, our community engagement was fantastic throughout this. One of the, Shannon, you can go to the next slide, please. One of the things we have in Peoria in our region too is the Central Illinois Coalition Active and Response Planning. You'll hear it called SILCARP quite a bit. So I'll kind of brush over the mission real quick, and that is to improve an all-hazard response in the Central Illinois region through effective communication, planning, and coordinated exercises. SILCARP encourages the collaboration between regional healthcare organizations, emergency responders, regional emergency management directors, public health, and other response planners while supporting the development of cooperative partnerships in order to promote the essential services they provide to the public. So I wanted to read that mission because it highlights a COVID response. Everybody listed in that mission was at the table or has communicated throughout a pandemic response. And our coalition, our SILCARP, meets quarterly with each other. We're all familiar with each other. We all have access to each other on a daily basis, which made our response that much easier. I know when Peoria County decided to open up their incident command, we sat in a room and talked about it, and we're very comfortable with each other talking about it because we have this SILCARP meetings. We collaborate with each other. We're constantly talking to each other. It just made things that much easier. It made things easier to allocate PPE, to talk about PPE in the county. Everything that we did had a function, and it all came to fruition through years of planning. I think our EMA, our county EMA, said that multiple times, even when we stood up the incident command. This is why we've been meeting quarterly and every other month for situations like this. Now our response has become a lot easier because we're more comfortable. So when we look at the vision of that, it's to create a comprehensive and resilient response to catastrophic health events via collaborative partnerships and harmonization of activities among our emergency management, emergency medical services, healthcare organizations, public health departments, and response agencies and entities supporting emergency function ESF8. So in an all hazards response. So typically, this is not an this is a atypical response. COVID-19 was for the SOCARP, but because we were comfortable with each other, it became a typical response. With that, I don't have anything else to add, and I can turn it over to Randy Martin if there's no questions for me.
There was a question about ransomware attacks incorporated into emergency planning, and Ed, I don't know if you were asking if that's something that becomes part of the HVA or just if it's considered.
Yeah, so we do have, when we send out our HVA, it does include IT failure. We don't have ransom attacks on there, but it wouldn't be a bad thing to plan for those attacks. I would engage in IT in that for sure to make those plans. As emergency preparedness and emergency management, that's probably the response would be in the scope, but putting the plan together would be more of an IT function, I would think.
Great. Okay, good. Thanks.
Thank you.
All right, can everybody hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I'm Randy Martin. I am the Emergency Preparedness Coordinator for OSF St. Joseph Medical Center in Bloomington. I spent a little over 30 years working as a police officer and retired as Deputy Chief from East Peoria PD. During that time, I spent some time in the DARE program. I was in the Detective Bureau for a short time, and I did asset forfeiture. But the largest job that I had before I left was the CALIA accreditation manager. CALIA is similar to the Joint Commission, where they require you to have a policy manual that reflects on standards throughout the law enforcement. I left, when I retired, I went to the Paradise Casino, and I worked for Boyd Gaming for 6 years. And during that time, the Coast Guard is in charge of the casinos that are on the river, and they require MARSAC, which is similar to Joint Commission. You have to do drills, you have to prepare plans, etc. Then I went to, I was a deputy director for a 911 center for a year, where I wrote the CALIA manual for that department. And then I came to OSF. This is my third retirement job. Retirement does not work real well for me. I started in security for a year or two, and for the last 3 years, I've been the Emergency Preparedness Coordinator, where I am required to do Joint Commission stuff. Next slide, please. So to add on to what Randy's been talking about, very, very important to worry about your supply chain. We heard a little bit about that earlier, but for some of you might remember that September 20th, 2017, Hurricane Maria shut down 50 pharmaceutical companies in Puerto Rico. Why did that impact us? Well, our pharmacist was a little concerned about getting some of the medications because that's where some of this supply was coming from. Many people are aware that India sends us a lot of drugs. The ingredients for those drugs comes out of China. COVID-19 kind of shut down that supply to India. It also shut down our supply for N95 masks because we are well aware of that China knew about this pandemic before we did, and so they did not ship out where they were holding on to their shipment because they knew they were going to need it. So when it hit the United States, all of a sudden we had a supply chain issue. But a supply chain is not just for medication. You really need to be thinking about where all of your stuff comes from. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit later, but just very, very important to track back everything that comes into your hospital. Where does it originate? Because there's a lot of world trade going on. And so what happens in the world does impact us locally. Next slide, please. So we should have a standardization across all emergency management in all the hospitals. A lot of it is the hazard vulnerability analysis, which Randy talked a little bit more about in depth. But our HVA, we do have to go out, and here in McLean County, we do the same thing that they do in Peoria County. We include our other hospital, we include the police, the fire, the city organizations to get their input along with public health. The other thing that we need to standardize is the emergency operations plans. And when I talk about standardization of our EOPs, I am talking about what's in them, not what they look like, but basically what does it involve. So for those of you who are not familiar with EOPs, you really need to have the HVA in there. You have to have capability and sustainability. You have to have incident management. Who is trained in NIMS and who is your organizational chart, who's going to be in charge of telling you, hey, we need to open incident command. We have an emergency, and here's who's going to be appointed. You need the responsibility and authority, the delegation of authority, the 1135 waivers. You need a whole chapter on communications. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. Within communications, you need to also know what kind of communications can you do, not only internally in the hospital, but externally. Resources and assets, you need safety and security, staff roles and responsibilities, chapter on managing all your utilities, that's water, natural gas, phones, medical gases, sewer. You also need patient clinical support activities. How do you test your EOP? Which leads me to the after action report. The Joint Commission requires that we do drills. The reason that we do the drills is to find out what works well and what are the areas of improvement. When you identify the area of improvement, that might cause you to come back and change your EOP. But once you've done that, you need to retest to make sure that it works. As an example, we have a birthing center in our hospital. We have a policy and procedure in place, as do all OSF hospitals. And what the policy says is that when the alarm goes off, they have what's called HUGs, the electronic system that's attached to the baby on a armband. When that goes off, the nurses within the birthing center have no more than 2 minutes to identify if somebody's missing, who it is, and then call it an emergency. Then switchboard puts it overhead, security responds, as does all the employees. They go to locations that are been pre-appointed to them and try to observe. We did the test. We have when the alarm goes off, the doors lock, but because of life safety, you have to allow beans to get out. So if you hold the bar in for 15 seconds, you can exit that door. So we tested it one day. We had a gentleman walk over with a doll, had the Hugs bracelet on. Hugs went off like it's supposed to. The alarm went off. It only goes to the switch or the computers in the birthing center. He held the door for 15 seconds, gained access, and then he walked. He did not run, he walked on a pre-approved path that took the longest way to get to the farthest door to exit. He was caught by security as he was going out that door. Time, it was about 3 minutes. So we went back and we took a look at this, and including a 15-second delay to the nearest door, if you plan your route very well, you can be out of this building with a baby in 30 seconds or less in a car and off the property before the alarm even gets out to security. So we went back and we thought, how can we change this? What we did was we contacted IT, and we were able to get the Hugs system not only to the computer in OB, but also to our switchboard operator's computer and our security officer's computer down by the main emergency room. So we have not tested it yet. This just happened about 2 months ago, or about a month ago now. COVID has kind of delayed doing a lot of things here at the hospital for emergency management. But we are eager to test this to find out if we can secure our location a lot quicker than that 2-minute delay. Next slide, please. So planning for the unexpected. In your community HVA, you know, Randy talked about tornadoes, and that's on our list also in McLean County. That's our top one. Severe weather, again, top part. But we have other incidents that could cause issues. How do you develop a plan to cover all of the unexpected things that could happen? So you don't have a plan for a car accident. You don't have a plan for a tornado. You don't have a plan for an Amtrak going off rail. You develop plans for a surge. It's an all hazards plan. So if an incident happens in the community, such as a tornado, Amtrak, or an explosion, or a Clinton nuclear power plant blowing up, we have a plan that talks about surge. How many and how quick can you activate surgeons to your ED? How quick can you get more personnel to get into your ED? And of course that flows throughout the hospital, right? You develop those plans, but then you have to test them. And again, we're right back to what I was just talking about. You test them, you take a look at them, and then you develop your EOP. Next slide, please. So we're not able to control all of the events that might occur. But you need to know what your resources are so that you can react to them quickly. That includes internal and external issues. So some of the internal issues, some people don't even think about what could happen inside your facility. We talked a little bit about cybersecurity. That was on my list here to talk about. And I see that Stick just put out a message maybe an hour ago. And that's one of your resources that you really need to know about is if you're not part of Stick, STIC, your hospital really should be connected to them. And that's just Illinois specific, I understand that. And I can't comment on what the other states have, but it is run by the Illinois State Police, and all of our emergency managers can sign up for that and have access to their items that they send out, and there's a lot of them here lately, especially with COVID. But you also have to worry about power outages, flooding, and active shooter. And when I say active shooter, I'm not talking about somebody walking in off the street. I'm talking about an ex-employee or an employee that has a grudge that he's going to take care of an issue inside the hospital. We have recently, within the last few months, had a shooting occur in Bloomington, 2 opposing groups. Unfortunately, at our hospital, we wound up getting 2 patients from opposing forces. Both of those people wound up in our intensive care unit. So we were able to do a lockdown for our our ICU. Well, what are you going to do with your 2 patients? We put them on either end of the floor, but they've got visitors coming in. They've got relatives wanting to come in and see them. And so you have to react to that. That's an internal issue. External issues are something similar to like a tornado is going to hit your building. There might be an explosion in your community, multiple people coming in, airplane crash, Amtrak derailment, or possibly a pandemic. All of those lead to a mass casualty event. And as long as your plans are reflecting mass casualty, a surge, then you are better prepared for what might happen in the community. Next slide, please. So Randy mentioned at Silcarp that you need to be aware of them. Here in McLean County, we have the McLean County Disaster Council. And I think Alex is going to talk a lot more on that, so I'm not going to go into it. But Randy's absolutely correct in that you need to know your folks. You need to know who is going to respond. But when you're doing planning, you also have to worry about Joint Commission standards. Your plans absolutely need to reflect what those standards are, because those are national standards. And in a national emergency, what happens when FEMA comes into your facility after the emergency is over? They want to see your they want to see your plans. They want to see what you did with your incident command, which we'll talk a little bit about NIMS. But if you don't have all of those in place, you might miss out on federal dollars. And that's one of the potential risks in your planning. You need to make sure that you've got everything in a row so that that doesn't happen. It also calls for NIMS training, National Incident Management System. That's what Incident Command is based on. That is what all top-level executives within the hospital need to have, whether it's 100, 200, 700, or 800, the classes. FEMA is looking at that. We had a Joint Commission visitor about 2 years ago. We had a power outage here at the hospital. It blew up, well, it took us out for 17 hours. We were without power. Both generators failed. The first question that they asked me when they came in was, can you please show me a list of everybody that has been trained in NIMS, which I was able to produce. So they will ask. Just FYI, you need to be prepared for that. Next slide, please. So takeaways, consider your supply chain. I talked about PPE and I talked about medication. What about fuel for your generator? If a tornado hits town and your generator is starting to run out of fuel, well, what are you going to do? What about water? Who is your supplier for water, drinking water, and for, you know, to flush your bathrooms with? If you say Walmart, great. I hope Walmart didn't get taken out in the tornado. What about food for your patients and for your employees? Where is that coming from? What is your source? And if your source is unable to provide, what's your secondary? What's your third choice? And what routes are they going to be taking? And are the routes compromised? These are some of the things that you have to consider with the supply chain. That's just local. And I've already talked about, this is worldwide. So you really need to be paying attention to what goes on in the world, as well as within the region. Communication redundancy. A little bit of that was talked about. I will tell you that about a year and a half ago, we went to our foundation. We got a $20,000 grant, and we purchased portable radios. Those radios were put in place all throughout the hospital. All the floors got them, all the different departments got them, and we practiced them monthly. I do a drill monthly to make sure that they work and everybody knows how to push the button and talk into the right hole. And nobody really thought about it until COVID hit. Right now, when a COVID patient gets moved out of the ED to CT or to X-ray, or well, wherever they're going to be moved within the hospital, everybody now has a radio that they can talk directly to each other and communicate that they're moving, that our housekeeping needs to clean the elevator out or the room out. Everybody's got a radio and everybody's able to communicate effectively. Mercy Radio, that's our statewide emergency radio network that the ED talks to our ambulance services. What happens if that goes out? How are you going to communicate? About a year ago, that did happen to us. Ambulance comes in, says, "We've tried to call you. Your Mercy radio's not working." We found out that neither was Carl's across town. It was our fault. We had a wire that got crossed and was sending out a signal that blocked all Mercy communication within McLean County. We got that fixed. But we also now have a StarCom. There's two different types of StarComs. One is IDPH, which Randy is in charge of with Region 2, that we are able to communicate directly to him at Region 2, or we can communicate directly to other hospitals if need be. We have another StarCom radio that is strictly for McLean County ambulances. And we do have access to that. We can communicate directly to Metcom, which is the dispatch system for all of McLean County fire departments, et cetera, except for Bloomington City. We can monitor Bloomington ambulances, but we can't communicate directly to them. You need to talk about securing your building, both externally and internally. Can you lock down your entire building from one location, or do you have a plan to be able to physically get to all the doors and lock it down in case there's an external issue that you don't want people coming into your hospital? Similar to COVID. We did it, we went to a lockdown for that. And internally, which I already talked about in our ICU, where we're able to secure just the ICU. We still needed security officers posted at the door because a lot of the friends and relatives of the shooting victims were giving us different names, and they're playing the name game. Again, test your plans and make sure your EOP is working. And then COOP. That is the continuity of operations. And I already mentioned a little bit about that. That is your list of who's going to be in charge, but what happens if they're not available? Who's their secondary? Who's their third? And what responsibilities do they have that are going to be allowed to take place? With that, I think if you change the slide, I think it's Alex. Alex, over to you.
Thanks, Randy. My name is Alex Trickett. I'm the Manager of Safety and Emergency Preparedness for Carl Broman Medical Center. We were previously Advocate Aurora. So again, I kind of oversee environmental health, safety, inspection, risk assessment, life safety, regulatory compliance, as well as emergency preparedness. Just a little bit about my background. I do have experience in emergency management with our county emergency management agency. Have been on multiple volunteer fire departments in the past and have dabbled in law enforcement as well. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to kind of talk about a few of the things that are unique to McLean County for community preparedness. Randy mentioned earlier, we do have a McLean County Disaster Council here in our county. It's been operating for 51 years currently, and it is comprised of emergency services, public health, social service agencies, and private businesses. So all our local fire departments, law enforcement agencies, dispatch agencies, rural fire, rural EMS, our hospitals, Red Cross, our county emergency management, including some private businesses like our airport authority and NICOR are all involved in our McLean County Disaster Council. The main goal of the Disaster Council is to plan and conduct one full-scale disaster exercise each year for our community. In the past, it's been everything from a hazmat incident to a tornado going through a local community. And then since we do have an airport in our community, with FAA regulations, we are mandated to do an airport disaster drill once every 3 years. Next slide, please. Just a couple quick pictures. This is one of our recent drills we did at our airport. So we do have volunteers throughout the community that perform as actors. They are moulaged up with makeup, realistic injuries. It tests our emergency response out onto the field. And then the center picture is of Carl's emergency department, where these patients are then transported, and then we as a hospital can test our emergency operations plan for any type of mass casualty incident. Next slide, please. Another unique thing that we have in McLean County was just started this past December. We did a community disaster workshop, and this was conducted with the assistance of the McLean County Disaster Council, ISU's emergency management, and Illinois Wesleyan's emergency management. And those are two large college campuses that Carl Broman sits right in the middle of. This consisted of more than 90 local government, hospital, insurance, and education leaders, and it was a half-day educational workshop. So we really focused on disaster preparedness and community resilience. And one of the things that this really brought together was senior leaders through all these institutions and entities for community preparedness. Kind of my title, Breaking Down Silos. So a lot of us, we create plans for our hospital or for our business, and we kind of operate within those silos. This really brought those leaders together to try to break down those silos and start creating a community preparedness plan with everybody involved. Next slide, please. Just a little about the course outline. As also was mentioned earlier, in 2013, Washington, Illinois sustained a severe tornado. It started out with a presentation with the current city manager of Bloomington, Tim Gleason, and the Tazewell County Emergency Management Director. Tim Gleason was the city manager for Washington when the tornado incident took place. They gave a great presentation on what occurred, lessons learned, and how we can be more prepared as a community to respond to a disaster such as a large-scale tornado. Following their presentation, it was a G402 class, NIMS overview for senior officials. So this basically just touched on, for senior officials, what they need to be prepared for to do in any type of disaster. We also touched on then we conducted a tabletop exercise, which was a large-scale tornado impacting our community. The great thing about this was the impact that we had for this tornado and that we designed impacted utilities, impacted businesses, including our hospital. For this tabletop exercise, our hospital was pretty much completely destroyed by this tornado. So again, not only for the community, but for our disaster plans, really for these senior officials looking at what we would do following a disaster of this nature. And it really forced senior officials to think outside the box and communicate with one another, come together, and provide plans of how we can assist each other as a community instead of staying kind of within our silos. Next slide, please. So again, the tornado severely impacted Bloomington Normal with utilities, emergency services, communications, educational institutions, and multiple businesses. Throughout this workshop, it was really great to see leaders come together and to discuss what they could offer to other impacted businesses. We all know at the beginning of any incident, emergency services is going to be foremost and be pretty taxed. So, once that's done, and then we start to rebuild the community, how we can rebuild that together and how our plans can come together and unify those plans. So again, it forced leaders to explore their emergency preparedness plans and how those plans specifically affect community preparedness. Throughout this, and back a slide, please. Thank you. So we identified through this numerous areas where we can help each other out, we can assist each other with our plans, and we also identified gaps. Just going off some of the gaps that we identified ourselves for our hospital, a lot of our plans, since we do sit right in between large college campuses, Illinois State University and Illinois Wesleyan, involves those entities. If we do ever have to evacuate our hospital, we do go to Illinois Wesleyan. Well, in this situation, Illinois Wesleyan was severely compromised as well. So then it's looking at our plans and trying to figure out, okay, now we need a secondary backup plan if that is affected. Another one too, with our hospital being destroyed, is how we maintain continuity of operations. With our incident command, we have a designated area in our hospital that our leaders meet for the incident command system and make decisions. If we can't meet there, where do we go to fulfill that? We have been working on plans now to have a backup incident command location off-site that our leaders can go to make those critical decisions and communicate with other entities in the community following a large-scale disaster. Next slide, please. So we really wanted to focus on 4 core capabilities for this workshop, just to mainly keep things concise, to keep people on track instead of kind of getting into the weeds of the details of the disaster. We focused on community resilience, public information and warning, operation coordination, and economic recovery. We all have touched on community resilience in past slides, but public information and warning is another big one. And any incident of this nature, public information is, in the front. We want to get a word out to our community of what's going on and what they can do. We have a public information officer at Broman. OSF has their public information officers, and so do other entities. Our public information officers throughout this workshop now have a way to come together and create a cohesive message that we can send out to the community of what to do, where to go. If our hospital is severely impacted and we cannot accept any more patients, that message can go out as well. Operation coordination, so everything from the initial operations of emergency services, them being taxed, to now rebuilding, where are we going to send our patients? And that's again where working with both Randy's, with OSF helping us, being another hospital across town, with our healthcare coalition, where we can send these patients that we currently have. And then last, economic recovery. So this picture that I have shows the devastation that was sustained in Washington, Illinois from the tornado. So this is kind of what we were looking at for this exercise. The economic recovery from this, it's going to be a huge undertaking. So getting all these leaders together to discuss how we can come back together as a community stronger than we were before. How we can get our utilities back up, what is going to take precedence. Obviously emergency services, healthcare, but then getting the utilities restored to operate those. If we don't have any electricity, hospitals will be on backup generators. How we can get fuel to them to keep them powered. Water, Randy touched on, we need clean water. We need those plans to sustain businesses. Education, with Illinois Wesleyan and Illinois State University, now we have 20,000 some students in a devastated community that we need to find a plan. So again, just kind of, these are things that we've done in McLean County. I can only imagine now with COVID, once that settles down, bringing these entities back together and coming together to try and kind of look at what we can plan on for the future. It's going to be very different. If there are no questions, that is the end of my presentation.
Thanks, Alex. I'm watching to see if there are any questions on the chat. Yeah, Cheryl, good point. There are, this morning on the national news, there's a discussion about IT issues. I'm experiencing one right now. My primary internet went down and I'm on backup internet. So yeah, we've become eerily dependent on that. If you guys, the participants, if you've got questions, chat those, type those into the chat. I have a couple of things that I want to follow up with these guys on and get some more input from them. I'm not intentionally trying to fill dead air. A couple of things I've been writing as they've been talking and looking at what we discussed we wanted to try to get for you guys today. I'll introduce these questions by way of an example. At our company, we talk about something, I call it practical preparedness. And it is a story that evolved from me as a young firefighter. I had joined my college department after learning to drive fire trucks at 17. And I got cut loose one night to drive, and long story short, I on my way to a house fire, I get there without the headlights on, and along the way, somebody had been flashing their headlights at me, and arrogant Will at 18 or 19 or whatever I was, I'm thinking, yeah, idiot, I'm in the fire truck, I'm going to the fire. Sure, they were thinking, hey, idiot, in the fire truck, your headlights aren't on. And I use that as an example to say, that is practical preparedness. Like, we taught me to drive and we taught me to keep it between the lines and to get water out of it. But nobody ever said, hey, Will, while you're sitting still, put your hand on the headlight switch or put your hand on the windshield wiper or the defroster switch, right? And make sure you can do the practical stuff to safely get this thing down the road. And so what I'm going to ask these guys is, there are three things that we identified within the list of questions that were discussed for this webinar. One was about challenges to preparedness, one was about lessons learned, and one of those was best practices for communication. There was a list of things, but the ones that I pulled out. And what I'm curious about is, as a practical matter, if any of you guys was sitting down, and it's what we do as consultants, and we work with guys like you all the time, if we were sitting down and having a meeting and I said, hey, practically speaking, what are the headlight switches and the defroster switches that we need to try to communicate to your leadership, to your employees? And so let's talk about, just practically speaking, to address the challenges to preparedness. What can folks do? What can the participants do, whether it's within their organization or whether it's some external challenge to preparedness? What's a really practical step that they can take to begin to overcome those challenges?
Hey, Will, this is Randy Haley. I can field that question.
Thanks.
So I like your analogy of the fire service. I do have a background in fire service, so I'll kind of build on that. I preach and talk to my guys all the time about building the base in the fire service. What I mean is going back to the basics. So when we write our EOPs, essentially you're laying a base for response, right? Practical response to whatever happens. So for a practical response, you need to have that base level of knowledge of what is in your EOP and how to utilize that, where it's at. Do your employees have a working knowledge of the EOP, where it's located? Practical knowledge of that, you can't use something if you don't know where it is, i.e. example, your light switch. So that's how you build your base. You get that message out there, let people understand where the EOP is, and I think that's really the base for a hospital response program is your EOP.
And let me add to that, if I can.
Okay.
We've done several tabletops. We've done several drills with our management. And the feedback that we always get is, well, nobody at the front line participated, so they really don't have a clue what was discussed at the tabletop. So we're trying to get more of our frontline people involved in the drills themselves, if that makes sense to you.
It does. It does. Yeah, and something that I wrote down earlier is that, we, in our perspective, as a consulting firm, we hear from the staff and we hear from the leadership when they talk about each other, and you're right. Sometimes one says, oh, they're never involved, and another one says, well, they're never involved. And so getting them involved so they understand one another's perspective, which kind of leads us to, and Alex, if you've got anything to add to that, jump in, but I want to make sure you guys see the question in chat also, which relates to where we're talking about right now, about engaging senior leadership and when there's not an emergency, so in the non-COVID times. But Alex, I'll give you the floor to see if you want to address that or what we've been talking about.
I just had one comment. What we were talking about was, as Randy said, the frontline leadership. Just kind of, as we all know, when disaster strikes, it's not a Monday through Friday, 8 to 4:30. It usually happens on a Saturday at 2 in the morning. So your frontline leadership is, or frontline staff is, who is on site and who's going to have to tackle that until we can get more resources in to assist them.
Great. Do any of you guys want to talk about, I have some thoughts too to address the question about engaging leadership. Does anybody want to tackle that or talk about the challenges or successes you've had there?
I can talk about what we do to engage some leadership. I know the gentleman very well that sent that question in, so he and I can have a sidebar conversation. But so one thing that we do, and we started annually last year, was we require all of our incident command staff to have NIMS training. What we also do is do an incident command course. It's not an emergency situation. It's a way to engage everybody in the functions of incident command system. We found one thing that I'd like to touch on, that to engage leadership in this is to keep practicing your incident command system. We just conducted a Regional 2 drill with all 24 hospitals across the region for incident command. And one of the things that I found was every single person stood up and said, hey, we've had our incident command open since February. We're really good at incident command. Well, what we found during the drill was, yeah, we might be really good at incident command during a long drawn out response, such as COVID-19. But when a bomb blows up in the park, our incident command may be a little clunky getting out of the gates. So we have to practice both sides of it. Yeah, the communication, I think, has definitely highlighted, or the pandemic has definitely highlighted our communication and heightened those senses. But it's now we get battle fatigued and battle worn into this incident command response, where now it's just second nature at this point. But until the bomb goes off in the park, now we have to scatter.
I would like to add to that. So one of the things that we've been looking at, we really haven't had the chance to do this yet. Again, COVID has kind of put a wrench in a few things, but one way that we kind of identified in the previous year to get our senior officials more involved in incident command was when we do have scheduled incidents. One example we have is coming up, we'll have a large utility shutdown to replace some switchgear, and it is going to impact the entire facility. A way that we can get people more comfortable in a controlled environment is to stand up our incident command to kind of oversee that event. If anything does go wrong, conduct an after action report to make sure that everybody's on the same page and run the same way we would as if it was an unintentional, unplanned event.
Let me just add just a little bit to the conversation. If there is anything that happens, and as Alex said, it's going to happen Saturday at 2 a.m., right? The first incident commander on scene is our house supervisor. So during our Region 2 drill that Randy was just mentioning, we practiced actually putting that into play with our house supervisor getting the first call from the ED, and then how that person then transferred that to our administrator on call to opening incident command. So we did practice that during the Region 2 drill.
Great. Yeah, thanks, guys. And a couple of things I wrote down, looking at quick activities, because these people are taxed for time. So anything you can do to break your exercises, your training, or anything down to shorter bites or time periods, even if it's 10 or 15 minutes, incorporating some level of peer pressure, and that relates also to having an agreement amongst those folks. What I mean is you pretty much have to get everybody at some point to stop, and while you're together, and say, what is it we're expecting of one another as senior leadership through the course of the year, not just during the disaster. And if one of you says, hey, I honestly, I'm not that interested in the training, then the rest of you have to agree, and that person has to agree, then you're not going to be as intimately involved in the, apparently my broken tongue is tied, in the response. So we have to agree that we've all got to do some level of preparedness. And if somebody's not, then we can agree that they have a role, but it's not a vital role. And that's sometimes hard. That's a hard thing to do. And that's got to happen within that leadership, beginning to develop them as a team. But that also helps them understand the value of emergency preparedness. And each of these guys just rattled off things that were instances where it's so important to have well-trained and capable leadership. And so helping them understand that there really is value in the emergency preparedness, and there's value in spending the time doing this. So the other thing I'd like for you guys to talk about, which relates to engaging senior leadership, it relates to those challenges in preparedness, is we've identified and talked about communications being an ongoing problem, whether it's the individual devices failing or whether it's, like, as I said at the beginning, how we exchange information. What are some best practices that you guys have incorporated, or that you have seen, or that you've learned through your time in your roles for improving communications, and we'll take communications big picture. It could be within your facility or system to community partners, or it could be just frontline staff with senior leadership and how you communicate within your organization. But what's a best practice that jumps to your mind as it relates to improving or maximizing communications?
I think just having the ability to communicate and knowing who to communicate to. I'm blessed here at St. Joe's. My president is very good at NIMS. She's very good at incident command, and she'll let you know that this is how it's going to run, and this is how we're going to do things. Externally, you need to know who your partners are, and that's and who to call, and that's why we have our networking meetings like McLean County Disaster Council, SILCARP, and organizations like that. And you also have social, or not social, but other non-business associations like Kiwanis, Rotary, that kind of thing, where you're constantly interacting with community leaders, and therefore you know who to call, and you probably have their cell phone in your phone at the time.
Thanks. Anybody else?
I can kind of hit on just what I think. I wholeheartedly agree with Randy Martin. Communication internally, if you incorporate or try to incorporate everybody, that's how you overcome those battles. Externally, like I talked about the Region 2, myself being the RHCC lead for that, getting that knowledge out to my senior leadership, guys like Alex and Randy, they know who I am, they know what the capabilities, and I can kind of serve as a tool between IDPH, the region, my hospital, the county. All that information comes in, and I can get that out quickly. There's things that I get sent that I distribute on a daily basis. So that form of communication, a lot of the ways runs through me as the RHCC and the HCC lead for Region 2.
Sweet, thanks. And again, Alex, you don't have to answer that. You may, or we can talk about the couple of questions that have come in by chat.
But we can move on to other questions.
All right, so let's take those in order, the two that have come up. And again, I've got more questions if we want to talk about some more things, but in terms of the question about it, what approaches have you seen for sustainability of long duration events, given the competing resources and daily activities? And I know some of you talked a little bit about continuity planning, and of course we can fall back on continuity plans, which have priority, right? So if we have to rob Peter to pay Paul, what are we taking from Peter? So hopefully we have a plan, but if some of you guys want to talk about how you've been doing that and what you've been implementing to deal with the fatigue.
Sure. Well, I can tackle that question also.
Thanks.
So I can kind of start back at the beginning of COVID and what we talked about when we talked about incident command. When we started ours, it was not a full-blown incident command. We did it virtually. We felt confident enough that we could talk often enough to be able to engage our technology and utilize that. Once we started seeing cases rise up north and even started to get into the central region for us, we decided to full-blown open up incident command. What that looked like for us was an incident commander and a co-commander is what we called it, and then myself sitting in a room daily. At the hospital at St. Francis, we're fortunate enough to have 5 different senior leaderships, more, but they all rotated in and out for the experience for one, and also to eliminate battle fatigue and the ongoing pandemic. Once things slowed down over the summer, we reverted back to virtual command, and we still kept our communications up. Currently, in current state, we're meeting twice a week and still keeping it on the forefront. So that you're right. It's been the longest incident command probably in U.S. history anywhere, but we just got to keep pressing on with it and not let our guard down.
Yeah, just
Randy or Alex, anything you want to talk about that?
yeah, just to kind of add to that, I think for us, rotating people in was a huge asset as well, just to prevent that fatigue. But I know in past with incident command, you've always kind of wanted to limit who's in incident command, so you don't get too many people in there, and then you don't get decisions made. I think with a virtual command that we've been doing since with COVID, we don't want to meet in person. And then it being such a long duration event, kind of now a more controlled event than it was at first. We've kind of expanded our incident command to allow more senior leadership in it. That way we can kind of expand and put the burden, instead of it being on a few people, to kind of on the shoulders of other senior leaders, instead of just a few people. And it's worked well for us, I think.
I will just say ditto. Right now, we're virtually once a week.
And something we've seen that, Alex, relates to what you said, we've seen a few people bring in, and even some projects that we're actively involved with, they've brought in different people. And I think, Alex, you were talking about, the expansion of senior leadership. Some folks have even brought in, if I'm A and you or B, then, who's C, should we both be sick? And they brought in that very junior person and kind of given them the opportunity to get involved. And it's a great opportunity for them to get involved and, practice the process. And it also brings in a little new enthusiasm because they're excited about the opportunity. Let's talk about AAR, and then and I see the note that moving to having 3 teams that have progressed on a rotation and so spreading some of this out, right, and creating a newer battle rhythm instead of daily, going to weekly or every 2 weeks, and really emphasizing what's important. The AAR one is interesting to me. We've actually been doing a series of webinars for some clients, and then some just through the company, about how to develop a COVID-19 AAR, because it is quite different. And as Randy just said, this might be the longest incident command activation. Most of us are used to doing AARs for an exercise that takes place over the course of a day or maybe a couple of days. And the exercise is designed with objectives, and it is designed with specific evaluation criteria. And here we are now trying to look back all the way to maybe even January when it first started being discussed, or maybe April when it was heavily in the United States. So how in the world do you get information and then organize that into an AAR? I have some thoughts on that because I've been talking about it, but I want to give you guys in your world the opportunity to talk about how you're approaching that and what you're doing for AAR for COVID.
Well, I can start. I started one in March. There you are. I'm not done with it yet. Just keeping highlights.
Okay. Yeah.
I think the county EMA is doing the same thing.
Yeah, just keeping it running. Okay.
Yeah, and that's kind of where we've been. We keep the minutes of our incident command meetings. If there's a follow-up item, we keep a log when those items are rectified. But then again, we're at the point where it's just a huge trove of data, and how to sort through that and to come up with a useful AAR. Specifically for us too, in the middle of this pandemic, we switched from one healthcare system to another. So that for us does throw kind of another wrench in things, as policies and how we do things completely were shifted from one healthcare system to another in the middle of it.
Because you didn't have enough problems to deal with, right? Yeah. Randy, were you going to say anything about that? Haley?
Sure. I can jump in there. So yeah, the after action report, we just had this conversation yesterday. with our county officials and wanting to do an after action report. And it's hard to do one because we're not out of a pandemic yet. You know, I think I just saw an email come or my phone say that we just had 6,300 and some cases today alone. So we're still very much in this pandemic. I think that for an after action report, what that looks like at the end of the pandemic, you can obtain one through keeping detailed notes. I know after the first wave, we'll call it, in the summer, beginning of summer, a lot of the conversations were about 3 ups and 3 downs and what the response to the pandemic was in capturing that conversation. And then at the end, you take a look at both phases and kind of compare notes and then write your after action. That's how we're approaching it as I know St. Francis, and that would be my suggestion for everybody.
Okay, thanks. And I'll share a couple of things that we're hearing around the country, and it relates, Randy, to what you just said. Some folks are looking at it as there's no way, because we don't know what the end is, and we will forget the beginning by the time we get to the end. So let's try to develop some sort of a break in this. And if any of you have ever done an exercise where you've got a massive amount of information, but you really need to get some of that, the lessons learned, because, you know, so if your exercise is in March and you have tons of information, but you have a meeting the first week in April, there's no way the AAR will be written by that time, by that meeting in April, but you need some information. So you develop what's called a quick look review. And so we have several clients, and I think Minnesota is requiring this with their coalitions. At least a couple of our clients are requiring it of their coalition partners. But it's not a quick look review, but it is essentially a first wave AAR. And what they're doing is saying, hey, if we could, as of August 30, 31, how many ever days are in August? If we could, as of that date, so from January to the end of August, if we could do an AAR for that time frame, what it would allow us as a state, as a coalition to do is begin to create organized corrective action going forward, because we know this is going to take place for some period of time. So they put a line in the sand and said, and kind of like Randy Haley just said, whether you're calling that an initial review or to your actual AAR for that period, we've also found that it's really helpful for people, again, as I said, with an exercise, you have objectives. So if you could develop, and I'm putting in air quotes, objectives, but those objectives are more just organizing around some planning of it, right? Did you follow these portions of your plan? Did you, how did your incident command go? How did the communications with staff go? And so develop some, I'll call it buckets, if you will. Develop some buckets that you can begin to dump information. So everything related to communications, everything related to incident command, everything related to supply chain problems. You could further divide that by looking at how did we respond and how did we manage when we first learned of COVID in the US, and then when we first learned of COVID in our state, and then when COVID finally came to our system or to our organization or our facility, how did we manage within each of those 3 timeframes, and then within each time frame, we could further divide that and say, how did we, when we first learned of it, how did our communications go? How did our incident command go? How did our supply chain management go? There's lots of buckets you can put under each of those, but we found it really successful. We've written now for a couple of states, for hospital associations, and for several health systems, and for a couple of counties. We've written their COVID AAR, and Randy Haley makes a good point, and all these guys did. We're not done with it. So why did they choose that? They needed something to begin to organize. So that's been our success, is dividing that, creating those objectives. And the other thing for capturing information, each of these guys said we began in March, or we began sometime back gathering information. So we found that surveys, whether they're face-to-face workshops or a virtual workshop, but so a survey, a workshop, information gathering tools that go out, fairly basic information. We find that an electronic survey is really helpful because people can populate it, then you have the information organized. There are a lot of practices that are different from what you're doing in an exercise, and beginning to gather information. You know, it's almost too late now to say we're going to remember everything if nobody's been taking notes. So that means you got to cast a wide net to get as much information as you can. And if nobody's been taking notes, so as you cast that net, then you got to manage that info. So with that said, we've hit 90 minutes. I'm sure any of us, you guys, the participants, you have the emails. I will say on my behalf, and I know I gathered from meeting these guys fairly recently, I don't think any of us would mind if you emailed us and ask us questions. Nobody's going to send you a bill for that. And we're all happy to share from our experience. Anybody, any of the three of you have anything you want to say as a final wrap up, or just anything to close us out?
No, just thank everybody for their time and participation. It was an informative session.
I will say as my follow-up, as I did at the beginning, attitude reflects leadership, Captain. And so I'll challenge you guys to continue to dig into and be interested in emergency preparedness. If you can tell from the folks that presented today, this is not a sprint. It is a marathon, whether it's in COVID or whether it's just for tornadoes or any sort of an emergency. The disaster and emergency preparedness is an investment in time and energy. So thanks for your time today. Again, feel free to follow up with any of us. And I know that certainly ACHE is interested. If you guys want to know if there's other topics related to this you'd like another presentation on, share that with them. With that, thank you for your time. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we're close to a weekend.
Thanks, Will. And that concludes our session. Again, today's session is worth 1.5 hours of face-to-face education credit and will be applied to your ACHE account approximately 2 weeks. Also, please be sure to complete the evaluation for the session by visiting your My ACHE page, select My Online Learning from the Helpful Links section, and click on the Access My Courses button, and you'll be directed to the session where you can complete the evaluation. The recording for the session will be posted in the Learning Management System in approximately 2 days as well. Today's program is copyrighted in 2020 by the American College of Healthcare Executives, all rights reserved. Thanks for attending and continue to stay safe, everyone.